An entire city, hidden beneath the earth for thousands of years, waits behind a stone door, and from the first step we make together, the theme is clear and urgent. How could 20,000 people vanish into an underground labyrinth of 18 levels and still breathe, drink, eat, worship, teach, survive, and remain a mystery? And what does that say about the human will to endure when the surface above turns hostile and uncertain? We call it Derinkuyu, and yet even the name feels like a label placed long after the work was done, because the true city is not a word but a feeling that rises from cool stone and steady darkness, a slow exhale of air that has threaded through narrow vents and silent chambers since empires were young and fears were old. The feeling of a place designed to outlast panic and turn danger into a rhythm measured by footsteps and whispers rather than trumpet calls or burning fields. The first impression is paradoxical, because the deeper we go, the more we sense planning rather than improvisation, purpose rather than panic, a geometry of care cut into volcanic tuff that gave itself to chisels and patience. And in the shape of these rooms we hear not the echo of chaos but the quiet arithmetic of survival. How much air, how much water, how much grain? How many people can pass in a minute through this corridor if a door rolls into place and the world above begins to hunt for those it cannot see? That is our promise tonight, and it is our argument from the outset, because this is not simply a cave system or a refuge of convenience, but a deliberate city with lungs and veins, with customs and boundaries, with wisdom hard-earned in the language of rock and time. And as we trace its edges we will ask who first imagined scaling life across strata of stone, why this happened here in Cappadocia, and how an absence of sunlight became a presence of design. Listen to the air, because air is the first clue, the difference between claustrophobia and community. And here the city breathes through long shafts that climb like invisible trees toward the surface, opening into branches that thread across kitchens and corridors, so that smoke finds its way out while oxygen finds its way in, forming a silent pact with those below who learn to place fire where it would warm but not suffocate, learn to cook where the draft would draw, learn that survival is a science disguised as routine. Touch the walls, and you feel the memory of tools, a history etched in strokes that repeat until they sing, marks that tell of generations who extended what they inherited rather than erased it, hands that studied what the stone would accept and what it would reject, because in soft rock there is kindness but also collapse if you forget the geometry of strength, and so pillars remain where they are needed, ceilings arch to distribute weight, and load-bearing corners know more about pressure than any battle plan engraved on a shield. Water comes next, and with it the subtle drama of trust and fear, because some wells reach down toward aquifers and some remain isolated from the surface by design, as if the builders knew that the greatest threat is sometimes a cup offered by the wrong hand, so they drew water from below and guarded its path, the city's hidden stream that fed bread, bathed children, anointed the sick, and bought time when the harvest above was taken by weather or by war, or when footsteps on the plain were footsteps to avoid. The doors are astonishing for their simplicity and their leverage, carved discs of stone that roll into place across narrow passages and hold the world at a controlled distance. Not as a wall forever but as a question asked in stone: who are you? Why are you here? Will you pass? And at what cost? While behind those doors the inhabitants could move through narrower threads of space, using the architecture as a script for defense where strength is multiplied by design rather than bravado. Here, nothing is wasted, because even the shape of a hallway is an instruction, and the slight tilt of a floor tells water where to rest while dry grain finds a higher shelf, and niches in the wall memorize the positions of lamps, and soot on the ceiling becomes an archive of long nights, and the repeated curve of a room teaches voices how to carry, so that songs and prayers could be shared without shouting, because in a city like this, volume is a resource as precious as heat. We imagine stables near the upper levels where animals could breathe easier and be led out when danger passed, and below we imagine communal rooms where instruction and story kept the mind above fear, kitchens where bread rose like a small miracle in a place without sunrise, and spaces of devotion where the unknowable could be named in whispers, and through all of it we imagine the governance of necessity, the rules that grow where infrastructure is intimate and every mistake has a cost. Even now we do not know precisely who began this work, and that is not a weakness of the story but one of its strengths, because mystery widens our attention and makes us careful, and the leading candidates' Phrygian hands beginning a pattern, later Byzantine expansions refining it in periods of persecution and invasion prove less about ownership than about continuity, about the way a tool trails its idea through centuries until an architecture of refuge becomes part of a region's muscle memory. Above ground the landscape of Cappadocia looks otherworldly, with its pillars and cones and soft curves of stone that trick the eye into thinking fantasy has invaded the map, and that is why what lies below feels inevitable once you learn this rock, because tough invites the blade and keeps its promise if you respect its limits, a collaborative material that rewards patience with shelter, and the deeper lesson is that the earth here is not merely foundation but partner, a quiet ally to human caution and hope. If a city can learn to breathe, then it can also learn to wait, and Derinkuyu waited so well that its rediscovery feels like a memory rather than a surprise, a wall broken during renovation to reveal a corridor that had been there all along, like a pause in a conversation that resumes years later with the same warmth, the same unfinished sentence, because the city was never gone, it was only quiet. And in that quiet it taught us that secrecy is not always deception, sometimes it is care. I ask you to picture the moment the stone disc moves, to imagine the dull scrape of ancient weight sliding into its notch, the hush that follows, and the sound of air continuing as if nothing has changed, because the genius of this place is that it turns crisis into procedure, and it is procedure that calms. A shared practice that tells a frightened child this is what we do and this is how we do it and it has worked before. And suddenly a labyrinth is not a trap but a choreography of safety. Numbers matter because they test romance against reality, and the claim that up to 20,000 people could shelter here is not a boast but a question about logistics, about storage and replenishment and waste and rest, about days counted by lamp oil and measures of grain, and as we move deeper we will test these claims not to argue with the past but to measure its courage, to understand what the city asked of its citizens and what the citizens asked in return. Every mystery invites its myths, and we will hear stories about impossible dates and vanished builders and secret technologies that do not fit the texture of the stone, but here we will choose the older discipline, the one that listens to the material, reads patterns of chisel marks, notes the soot and the wear of thresholds, and in doing so we find not magic but mastery, not a leap beyond human hands but a record of human patience taught to thousands of surfaces until the surfaces learn to serve. The city is not only a response to threats from above but also a response to the weather of this plateau, to winters that bite and summers that glare, to winds that smooth rock into shapes of prayer and dust that settles like forgetfulness, and underground the temperature steadies, the noise lessens, the light becomes something you decide rather than something decided for you, and with that control comes a form of dignity that is as architectural as it is psychological. If we are honest, some of the appeal is fear transmuted into fascination, because all of us understand the instinct to hide, the surge of relief when a door closes and the outside cannot see us, the way a heartbeat slows in the dark once we know we are not alone, and Derinkuyu lets us touch that instinct without shame, shows us how a community can build with its fear rather than be built by it, turning anxiety into corridors, turning vigilance into design. There are stories of tunnels that connect Derinkuyu to other underground cities like Cappadocia, and whether every link is real or not, the idea itself feels true to the logic of the place, because redundancy is a principle, and if one route is blocked another may open, and networks are a form of wisdom in regions that have learned not to rely on a single gate, a single season, a single ruler's mood. And that is why thinking of this as a lone marvel is too small, because resilience prefers company. We will walk gently over thresholds worn by uncounted feet, and we will look for small signatures of daily life that make a city, a groove where a door stops, a shelf smoothed by hands, a corner where someone idled and traced a pattern into mortar while waiting for bread to finish, a place where a teacher stood because the acoustics favored the voice at that angle, a place where a mother marked a height on the wall and smiled, even here, especially here, because growth is a victory in any season. Time moves differently underground, not as a threat but as a layer, each moment pressed into the next without the tyranny of shadow's length, and that is why night is not an interruption here but a continuum, and why a documentary told slowly suits the place, because we are not only recounting facts, we are recalibrating pace, learning to read a city that speaks in the low voice of systems working, systems linked to bodies, bodies linked to trust, trust linked to stone. Even as we marvel, we keep our skepticism close, because skepticism is respect in a site like this, a way of saying we will not use your rooms to stage fantasies, we will anchor what we say to what we can touch and verify, and when we speculate we will say so, and that vow makes the wonder stronger, because the truth is already astonishing, and we do not need to gild it when the earth itself has chosen to be part architecture, part archive, part promise. Perhaps the most haunting thought is that the city did not think of itself as mysterious, it thought of itself as necessary, and that makes our curiosity feel like gratitude, because we inherit not only the rooms but the reasoning behind them, and when we recognize the logic we also recognize the people careful, anxious, clever, devout, tired, stubborn, loving who taught the stone to hold their fears without collapsing under their weight. Which is another way of saying they made a home. So the question of who built Derinkuyu blends into the question of who sustained it, and that shifts our angle from heroic origin to patient maintenance, from the first strike of a tool to the millionth lamp trimmed at dusk, and in that shift we meet the city's true authors, a line of caretakers longer than any genealogy, each one making small decisions that add up to continuity. And this is where the word civilization regains its modesty and its power. As we draw breath with the city, we begin to hear what it has to teach about our current obsessions, about growth without forecast, exposure without shelter, speed without endurance, and in the cool corridors a counteroffer emerges, one that values redundancy, invisible labor, quiet cooperation, and the kind of beauty that is only beautiful because it works, a beauty that outlives its builders by refusing spectacle in favor of service. Tonight, then, we do not only descend, we commit to a way of seeing that matches the city's own patience, and we accept that answering who and why will require listening to how, because the systems speak first, and as they speak we begin to understand the courage of choosing the unseen, the discipline of leaving a surface unadorned if the stone underneath needs the strength, the grace of making space for future lives whose names you will never know. There is one more reason to start here, with a door and with air, with water and with stone, and it is that these elements are older than any empire and kinder than most, and by reading them we sidestep the vanity of conquest and hear the chorus of survival instead. And that chorus is the music of Derinkuyu, soft and repeating, marked by care and return, patient enough to wait for us and wise enough to outlast our hurry. We will test the numbers, map the shafts, trace the wells, study the doors, follow the smoke, model the flow, and let the evidence walk ahead while our imaginations follow at a respectful distance, and in that procession we will keep one promise above all, to protect the silence that made this possible, because the city's first language is quiet, and we are guests, and guests who listen are invited deeper than guests who insist. And so the first lesson is already in our lungs, that a city survives when it learns to breathe in stone, and the second is in our hands, that a city endures when it teaches its materials to carry fear without breaking, and the third is in our steps, that a city stays hidden just long enough to be found by those who will understand it, and with that we step forward, the door eases back into place, and the world above becomes a story while the world below becomes a home for the night. The ground we crossed in the opening becomes a wider map now, and the first truth to set gently on the table is where we are and why this place exists at all, because Cappadocia is not just a backdrop but an origin, a volcanic landscape laid down by ancient eruptions that hardened into soft, workable tuff, inviting human hands to carve not merely shelter but a scaled system where life could be folded into the earth without breaking its rhythm. Stand at the surface and the terrain looks like a fable, spires and cones eroded by wind and rain until the land appears to be thinking out loud, and that is the first bridge between geology and city-making, because the same stone that yields to weather yields to chisels, and the same forces that sculpted fairy chimneys taught builders below what loads to respect and what shapes to favor, turning geology into policy and texture into instruction. Derinkuyu sits within this theatre of stone as both exemplar and outlier, a place that grew downward when others grew outward, not as a novelty but as a sober answer to the pressures of history and climate, and when people say it reaches 18 levels they mean an idea carried through strata, with upper tiers that interface with daylight and deeper tiers that hedge against siege and winter, creating a living gradient from the familiar to the safeguarded. Think of the upper levels as threshold spaces where animals could be housed and moved quickly if conditions improved, where smoke could escape with less persuasion and supplies could be rotated without exhausting the strength of a community, and then think of the deeper courses as a reserve of invisibility and time, where sound travels differently and temperature steadies and the day's shape is defined by what must be done rather than what must be endured. The overview continues with scale, and scale here is not a number used to impress but a framework used to explain design, because accommodating thousands of bodies means corridors sized for flow rather than spectacle, rooms shaped by the math of oxygen and heat rather than the grammar of display, and redundancies laid like a second language under every primary function so a blockage in one place does not become a failure in all places. Air is the first infrastructure to notice because it is the least visible yet most exacting, a lattice of shafts and transversal passages that turns a mountain of stone into a breathing apparatus, with vertical lines that pull and push depending on temperature and wind, and with lateral runs that lace the city's organs together so a kitchen can exhale, a storage room can stay dry, and a hearth can glow without becoming a hazard to the sleepers in the next chamber. Water is the second, and it is treated with a guarded intimacy that speaks of both scarcity and strategy, because some wells reach aquifers and some are intentionally sealed from the surface, a design that takes seriously the possibility of poison and the certainty of need, leaving behind a system that can feed bread and ritual, washing and remedy, across long intervals where outside sources are compromised or too dangerous to approach. Food storage follows, and here the rock's coolness is a gift to the calendar, allowing grain to keep and perishables to last a bit longer, with niches and bins arranged where airflow is measured and monitored by memory as much as by experiment, and with the floor's slight grades telling moisture where to settle and telling those who manage it where to look first when the season turns and the city's appetite changes. Security appears not as an armed presence but as a choreography of thresholds, passages that narrow and turn just enough to slow unfamiliar feet, and the famous rolling doors that can be moved by a few determined hands to close a corridor and test who knocks on the other side, not a wall of fury but a valve of caution, allowing the city to preserve energy by shaping encounters rather than provoking them. Within this scaffold, the overview widens into ordinary life, and ordinary life is where the marvel becomes intimate, because there are places where bread is made and the soot on the ceiling remembers each loaf, places where teaching happens and the acoustics encourage a voice to reach the edges without strain, places where prayer pulls the room into a soft circle of listening, and places where tools are kept and repaired because redundancy needs maintenance as much as it needs design. Even the light is not an afterthought, because lamps are placed where walls meet at angles that diffuse brightness, and niches are cut where flame can be sheltered from drafts while still feeding the room, and simple reflectors light stone. Smooth surfaces become quiet amplifiers that borrow a little more visibility from the same wick, a series of small attentions that together feel like a philosophy of care. At the scale of the city there are arteries that a visitor reads as corridors, but at the scale of a household those corridors separate privacy and proximity with tact, giving a family a small domain inside a larger one, delineating the neighborly and the intimate without a single painted line, the way a city should, by asking the built environment to mediate between necessity and dignity. As the overview takes in the past, the question of who began this and when becomes a constellation rather than a single star, with threads that point to ancient occupations and later amplifications, hands that inherited a set of techniques and refined them under pressures that changed names but not behaviors, the nervousness of invasions, the weariness of famine, the knowledge that the surface can become unsafe for reasons beyond any single community's reach. That continuity explains why the city's logic feels layered, because it did not spring from a blueprint released on a fixed date but from a problem set revisited across centuries, with new solutions added in ways that respect what already works, and that is why the rooms do not contradict each other but rather tilt in the same direction, toward a kind of invisible ledger where safety and comfort are traded without debt. Beyond the city's boundary, the region contains other underground complexes that suggest a network of practice, if not always a network of tunnels, and that matters to an overview because it tells us that this is not an isolated whim but a regional language, spoken with different accents in different places, sharing the same grammar of defense and storage, the same vocabulary of air, water, door, corridor, hearth. Returning to the ground plan, notice how circulation doubles as governance, because the route from a stable to a kitchen to a storage room is not only a path for feet but a path for responsibility, instructing the body in habits that support the whole, keeping fire away from grain, keeping refuse away from wells, keeping quiet away from choke points, and keeping watch where a small oversight becomes a large cost. Temperature plays a quiet role that is easy to miss in an aerial summary, yet underground the seasons are softened, the heat of summer leveled, the hard bite of winter dulled, and that smoothing effect allows work to proceed when the surface would distract or endanger, making the city not only a refuge from threats but a regulator of time itself, an equalizer that lets effort continue when weather would otherwise decide. An overview worth the name must include discovery and documentation, because the modern story begins with walls giving way and corridors appearing where none were expected, and from those chance openings the patient work of mapping and stabilizing follows, each new survey adding detail to a plan that was always there but never fully seen, teaching the present to read what the past wrote with chisels and quiet repetition. That reading, careful and slow, shows the builder's respect for structure, with columns left where they carry weight and arches carved where distribution favors the span, and it shows an intimacy with the stone's weaknesses, where a seam is avoided or bridged, where a curve accepts load better than a sharp angle, because knowledge here is not formula alone but a long apprenticeship to a particular material's temperament. Scale returns again in the estimate of how many could shelter, and the number is not a static boast but a variable bound to circumstances, to how long a stay is anticipated, to what the harvest was, to how much is stored and how many mouths share each room, and that is why any count is also a story about logistics and discipline, a measure of the city's capacity yoked to the community's restraint. The overview notices ritual alongside routine, because places of prayer and gathering are as prominent as storerooms and cook spaces, reminding us that endurance is not a mechanical affair, and that a calm mind keeps better watch than an agitated one, and that hope, however softly spoken, extends shelf life by reducing waste, reducing panic, and holding a group together through nights that feel longer than they are. Sound is another infrastructure, and not only for worship or instruction, because quiet is a safety layer in a system that values discretion, and rooms are shaped and placed so that a raised voice is a choice rather than a default, and so that alarms can travel without confusion when they must, while the rest of the time a city of thousands behaves like a library that decided to become a fortress without announcing the transformation. If the overview feels like a braid: air, water, heat, light, sound, food, movement, defense, that is because it is, and each strand reinforces the others until the whole becomes stronger than any part, which is perhaps the best definition of resilience, a nested set of answers that does not depend on a single perfect component but on a community's willingness to maintain many good ones. Look closer at the interfaces with the surface and the pattern becomes clearer still, because entrances are positioned and concealed to reduce detection, shafts are masked by ordinary features, and pathways are chosen to make approach manageable and retreat graceful, a geometry that turns geography into an ally and uses the land's slopes and outcrops to break lines of sight for anyone who does not already know where to look. The city's interior planning also honors the cost of error, placing high-risk functions where oversight is easiest and consequences are smallest, separating sparks from stored calories, separating noisy labor from rest, and keeping delicate stores where drafts do not whisper temptation toward mold, 1,000 small lessons that add up to an ethic of foresight as the only acceptable luxury in a place where luxuries are few. Stepping back again, the overview is a portrait of intent emerging from constraint, a design patience that takes what the earth provides and multiplies it by cooperative habit, and the result is a city that can feel invisible to strangers yet utterly legible to its own, because signs are everywhere for those who know how to read them, and the difference between confusion and competence is measured in footsteps rather than in symbols on a map. In the presence of such order it is tempting to assign a single author, a single founding mind, yet the cut of the stone resists that story, because the handwriting changes across rooms and levels, revealing a chorus of hands and a sequence of eras, and the best tribute is to name the city a work of continuity, a document signed by a lineage instead of a hero. When the overview turns to emotion it finds restraint there too, because nothing here begs to be admired, everything asks to be used, and that utility becomes beautiful in its refusal to be fragile, in its insistence that the truest ornament is a system that works, and that is why the city invites a long gaze rather than a quick glance, the kind of attention that rewards patience with understanding rather than surprise with spectacle. It is also important to recognize what is not present in this overview, because certain corridors remain sealed, certain chambers refuse to announce their purpose, and certain traces do not align with any current hypothesis, not because the past is cruel but because it is complex, and that complexity is permission to keep looking, to keep measuring, to let humility supervise curiosity. To connect this broad picture back to the experience of walking, imagine a sequence where every threshold whispers the next correct move, the way an airport's signs do when good design is at work, and realize that in Derinkuyu the signs are cut into the stone itself, in the way a floor inclines toward drainage, in the way a corridor turns toward a light well, in the way a doorway narrows where caution would be wise, making movement an education rather than a test. The city's relationship to the seasons completes the frame, because on days when winds scald or freeze, the underground steadiness becomes more than comfort, it becomes a way of preserving decision-making power, and on days when the surface is generous, the upper levels restore the link to sky and field, allowing the city to live in two modes without ever losing its identity in either. As a final sweep across this landscape of intent, notice the balance between secrecy and invitation, because a city like this hides from those who would harm it but welcomes those who belong, a dual logic achieved not by gadgets or tricks but by proportions and roots, by the knowledge that safety grows where complexity is legible to insiders and opaque to outsiders, a principle as old as shelter and as modern as any firewall. The truest overview understands that this place is not merely an artifact but a lesson plan, each system a prompt that asks what today's communities might learn from a town that treated risk as a teacher, redundancy as a kindness, and invisibility as a strength in times that demand it. And if that sounds austere, remember that in the quiet of these rooms children laughed, elders told stories, bread rose, songs were remembered, and a city practiced being alive without an audience. So the map resolves into a living diagram, Cappadocia's stone gifting its qualities to human need, human patience returning the favor by shaping stone without breaking it, and Derinkuyu standing as the most articulate sentence in a language perfected by repetition, a language that we can still hear if we lower our voices and let the earth finish what it began. A wall breaks and the earth exhales, and in that first breath a corridor appears where there should have been stone, a narrow invitation that turns a renovation into a revelation and a private home into the front step of an entire hidden city. The year is 1963 in the town of Derinkuyu, and an anonymous resident takes a hammer to a basement wall for reasons as ordinary as space and repair, only to find that space was already there and repair was not what the stone required, because behind plaster and rock lay a tunnel that did not care about property lines or modern plans. Stories in the region say the chickens vanished first, slipping through a gap that opened during remodeling, and the search for birds became a search for an opening that widened in the light of a lamp and a breath held too long, until the lamp found air and the air found a passage that knew where to go. What begins as a domestic problem unfolds into a civic astonishment, because the doorway leads to another doorway and the corridor forks, and the new map ignores the old map the way a river ignores a fence, leading not into a neighbor's cellar but into history laid in rooms and stairwells, a descent whose logic was carved by hands that expected to be followed. Officials are called, and the shock matures into process, because after wonder comes tape and measures and lighting cables and the careful rehearsal of first steps repeated by archaeologists and engineers who understand that discovery is a fragile thing until it is drawn, named, stabilized, and documented. The first surveys confirm what rumor refuses to hold, that the complex is not a mere cache of chambers but a city arranged in depth, a sequence that falls away from daylight into a vertical neighborhood of living rooms, kitchens, stables, storage spaces, schools, chapels, and arteries of movement planned to be used in darkness without confusion. Soon a figure becomes a number and the number becomes an argument, because the available passages suggest a capacity on a scale that belongs to towns rather than to hideouts, and the viability of months spent below ground demands to be tested against wells, ventilation, storage, and privacy, until the estimate of 20,000 souls no longer reads as a guess but as a challenge answered by stone and air. Depth is confirmed to be astonishing, on the order of roughly 85 meters or 280 feet, a plunge that would be outlandish if it were a single shaft but is instead softened by levels that pace the descent like the breathing of a careful climber, a nesting of safety and function layered 18 times. The first tasks are about safety and the second tasks are about meaning, because loose rock must be braced and unstable edges retired before rooms can be named and routes traced, and in this sequence the site earns its second birth, gently coaxed from hazard into hospitality so that knowledge can enter without injury. Rolling stone doors are found in place, proof that closure could be precise and swift, and the architectural grammar of defense reveals itself in bottlenecks and right angles, in narrow staircases that yield to wider rooms, in thresholds that hold the rhythm of traffic the way a conductor holds a pause. In the early years after the rediscovery, mapping proceeds like a spiral outward, upward, downward, connecting the practical to the sacred, the animal to the human, the child's study to the communal oven, and every corridor walked adds one more thread to a public memory that had forgotten not the concept but the coordinates. It becomes clear that Derinkuyu's systems are not accidents of erosion but decisions with consequences, because the ventilation shaft, reaching roughly 55 meters by current measures, doubles as a well and a lung, drawing water and air along paths that are defendable, severable, and repairable from below, the very definition of resilience in a time of siege. Wells that could be isolated from the surface are treated like arteries that can be clamped in an emergency, a biological metaphor that the site seems to insist on with every redundant channel and every controllable valve, because life underground is physiology carved into geology until both behave as one. As corridors are cleared and recorded, entrances are tallied, and the number grows across the months as private homes in the town relinquish their secret doors and stairs, embedding the city into the domestic grid above, a pattern that explains how quickly thousands could vanish without spectacle and reappear without a trace once danger eased. The archives of the stone start to align with the archives of the written word, and scholars and guides find a way to tell a story that admits uncertainty without dimming the light, that the city was formed over centuries, fully realized in the Byzantine period, used intensively in times of conflict, abandoned in the modern exchange of populations, and then slept until a hammer knocked. Dates settle where they can, with 1963 as the rediscovery and the late 1960s as the transition to supervised access, a civic promise that the site will be opened while being protected, and the scaffolding of tourism rises carefully because the rooms are not a theme park but an inheritance. By the mid-1980s the wider region's significance is formalized in the language of World Heritage, and the city joins a catalogue not of curiosities but of obligations, entries that ask living communities to become stewards of complex pasts that victims and victors alike once hid within. The first visitors, wearing the patience of new initiates, learn that what is open is only a fraction of what exists, because the accessible levels roughly 8 by conventional accounting are both introduction and boundary, a guided reminder that mystery remains part of the integrity of a place that lived on its secrecy. Within those open levels, the lessons are immediate, smoke needed exits, so chimneys and vents are married to kitchens, grain needed dryness, so storage rooms are positioned and shaped by airflow, bodies needed calm, so sleeping spaces are buffered by corridors and corners that turn sound into a soft companion rather than a threat. Every catalogue of rooms sits beside a catalogue of questions, and excavation is as much the art of restraint as of revelation, because cutting too far compromises the very qualities that preserved the city, and a site that survived because it managed air and temperature must not be forced into discomfort in the name of speed. Even now, there are sealed passages whose purpose is not yet agreed upon, stairways that promise but do not deliver, chambers that suggest ritual or craft but hold their meaning in the angle of a niche rather than in the generosity of an inscription, and prudence keeps such places quiet until methods catch up to curiosity. The modern work does not end with hard hats and surveys, it extends into models and simulations that test the plausibility of numbers handed down by law and confirmed in part by room counts and shaft diameters, because to say that 20,000 lived here is to commit to questions about air turnover, water draw, lamp oil consumption, and the logistics of waste without insulting the ingenuity of the builders. Guides find themselves becoming translators of evidence into empathy, reminding visitors that verticality is not spectacle here but strategy, that depth is not bravado but buffer, and that the narrowness of a staircase is an index of caution rather than a design flaw to be widened for convenience. Maps drawn by modern hands sit beside mental maps that would have been memorized by children who learned which turns lead to where by smell and temperature and the bounce of a voice, and the difference between those maps is not accuracy but intimacy, a difference that preservation must honor without pretending to restore. In telling the discovery, the narrative widens naturally to include the decades before forgetting, when Cappadocian Greeks and Armenians still used the underground spaces reflexively in response to news of violence and uncertainty, and the departure in the 1920s stores the knowledge away not in books but in absences that kept their promise until a wall fell. What the rediscovery returns is not merely access but context, because the city below makes sense of the landscape above, tying fairy chimneys and stone cones to the logic of soft tuff faithfully carved and allowed to harden into strength, and every step down becomes a footnote to the surface's strange serenity. Engineering details become narrative pivots, and the 55-meter shaft is no longer a number but a character in the story, cast as both provider and guardian, a column of air and water that could be defended from within and disguised from without, a belt that keeps the city's vital organ supplied under pressure. The discovery phase reveals more than rooms, it reveals habits, like the preference for placing animals nearer the surface where odors offend less and evacuation is simpler, or the location of communal spaces in zones where voices travel without needing to be raised, tiny mercies that multiply when the world above is unkind. In corridor after corridor the rolled stone doors receive their due, practical mechanisms that create time instead of causing panic, because a city that can close itself calmly can also think clearly, and the difference between a stampede and an ordered retreat is often the difference between a hole in a wall and a door designed to be a decision. The rediscovery is a technical tale but also a social one, because every entrance count that rises with each new household disclosure proves that Derinkuyu never belonged to a single building or family, it belonged to a web, and that web extends trust as much as it extends stone, knitting homes into a collective without eliminating their thresholds. When the first electric lights followed the first oil lamps back into the depths, the city's textures changed color but not character, and the job of illumination joined the job of interpretation, because light is not neutral in a space designed to ration it, and showing everything at once would be the same error as revealing nothing. Tourism adapts, learning the choreography of small groups and careful pacing, the art of allowing a room to finish its own sentence before another bus arrives, because too much attention can be a solvent like water, and a city that held its breath for centuries should not be asked to pant for applause. As the modern path through the site settles into something like a ritual, the first rooms encountered are staged to teach the grammar quickly: door, stair, shaft, niche, oven, trough, so that by the time a visitor reaches the deeper levels the language is not foreign and the silence can be heard without translation. Documentation becomes its own defense, because a site that is measured and described is harder to distort, and the temptation to inflate or romanticize the past is met with the comfort that the truth is already extraordinary, a city-sized apparatus of survival hidden in plain sight beneath a town that did indeed know its basement had a basement. The number of publicly accessible levels remains a reminder that ignorance can be a form of care, because every closed door protects something: air quality, structural integrity, or simply the dignity of uncertainty, and a good story is honest about where it stops rather than smashing ahead for the sake of one more gasp. Meanwhile, the The scientific questions age well, ripening into projects that monitor humidity, CO2, temperature gradients, and the micro-erosions of foot traffic, because endurance in an underground city is a matter of chemistry as much as of architecture, and preservation is not an oath but a practice repeated until it looks like instinct. When a guide points to a smooth threshold and says this is where feet prove that time passes, the remark bridges rediscovery to routine, showing how data and tenderness meet in places like this, where you can love a groove for what it tells you and still cordon it off so it can keep telling it for another 100 years. In the story of Derinkuyu's modern emergence, chance is the spark but discipline is the fire, and the community around it learns to live with a treasure that requires patience, learns to accept that not every curiosity can be satisfied with a photograph, and learns to say come in without promising to give everything away. The connection to neighboring underground cities, sometimes described in terms of tunnels stretching several miles, acquires a clearer voice during surveys that trace alignments and conjectures against bedrock and property, reminding everyone that networks are as much about compatible designs and shared techniques as they are about literal corridors. With each season the interpretive script adjusts, emphasizing that Derinkuyu is not a puzzle completed but a conversation resumed, that the city did not become real when tourists arrived but when a resident found the courage to step into the unknown and then to tell someone who could keep the opening from closing again. The paradox of discovery is that it must protect what it reveals from the impact of the revelation, and so gates are timed, paths are rotated, and sections are rested like fields between plantings, a rural metaphor that suits a town that once folded harvests into stone as carefully as it folded its children into sleep. At the heart of this modern chapter is a lesson in humility, because a city that hid from armies does not need to be defended from us by force, only by foresight, and the recognition that admiration without restraint is just another form of pressure that stone will not forgive. Even the dates serve as a kind of cadence, rediscovered in 1963, opened in the years that followed under supervision, enfolded into a global register of significance by the mid-1980s, and still, decades later, not exhausted, which is another way of saying that patience remains the correct speed for a city built to outlast hurry. The tale circles back, as all good stories do, to the first room breached by a hammer, and it is hard not to imagine the silence on the other side thick as velvet, waiting to be cut, waiting to become air again, and the feeling that the earth felt lighter that day, as if it had been relieved of a secret that was never meant to be a burden. In that single image the whole arc is contained, a private life meets a public past, a wall pretends to be the end until it becomes a beginning, and what was lost is not resurrected by magic but reintroduced by method, by hands that work slowly enough to leave the city recognizable to itself. To speak of Derinkuyu's discovery in the present tense is not an error but a courtesy, because the site continues to yield detail at a rate that keeps pace with our ability to absorb it, and even a well-known shaft or corridor becomes new when seen by someone for the first time with the right question in mind. There is a moment every visitor remembers, different in specifics but identical in temperature, when the light is just far enough away to make the world soft, the air is cool without malice, and the walls carry sound the way a stream carries leaves, and the fact that this sensation exists because someone kept walking after a wall gave way is a grace you can feel in your ribs. So the discovery does not end, it acclimates, teaching the town above how to live with a neighbor that is older than any census and calmer than any headline, asking for daily courtesies instead of annual parades, and rewarding those courtesies with the dignity of comprehension rather than the intoxication of novelty. If every rediscovery has a cost, here the currency is attention, paid out in careful steps and slow breaths, and the reward is an intimacy with the past that refuses to flatter us, preferring instead to recruit us into the same long project of maintenance that made the city possible in the first place. At the end of a day underground, the surface feels brighter but also thinner, more provisional, a skin stretched over organs that learn to work below, and the knowledge that those organs still function, still distribute air, sound, water, heat, and caution, is a reassurance that outlives any single tour. What began with a hammer settles into a vow, unspoken but sturdy, that a city rebuilt by memory will not be unmade by curiosity, and that the modern story of Derinkuyu will continue to be a patient one, measured not by how far we push but by how clearly we see. The city teaches defense by turning architecture into behavior, and the first lesson is that survival here is not an accident but a discipline sculpted into stone to slow threats, preserve breath, and keep order when panic would be the easier choice. The narrow passages and calibrated thresholds convert overwhelming force into single-file encounters, while whole floors can be sealed to buy time, proving that design can be a shield when men and weather cannot be trusted. Begin with the doors, because the doors are the mind of the city set on a pivot, circular stones that roll into place from within and lock a corridor with the finality of a sentence ending, a mechanism as simple as a wheel and as consequential as a wall. Each level can be closed separately, which means the city is not a single fortress but a stack of choices, a layered veto against intrusion where calm hands can reset the terms of an encounter faster than fear can spread. These millstone-like discs do not shout, they whisper a plan, and that plan is to transform the geometry of approach into a valve, a one-sided permission that defends without spectacle and exhausts an intruder's options by making every turn a question that only insiders can answer. Because the doors move from inside, power belongs to those who belong, and security is measured in familiarity rather than in force, a principle that gives a city its stamina while keeping its gentleness intact. Corridors tighten at the right moments, reminding the body that space is rationed alongside air and light, and in that rationing danger is slowed to a pace the city can manage, a single file where many become one and one can be watched, weighed, and denied. The turns are not theatrical, they are practical, breaking lines of sight and momentum so the defense can be local and intelligent, not a last stand but a series of informed refusals. Structure carries the ethics of foresight, and here arches and columns are not ornaments but covenants with gravity, keeping ceilings honest and loads distributed so that fear never wins the argument against endurance. In these rooms, strength is quiet and continuous, a posture that keeps people calm because the stone itself is calm, a stability you feel as soon as your footsteps stop echoing and your breath finds a comfortable rhythm. Defense is only half the lesson, because a city that breathes keeps its promises longer, and Derinkuyu's promises are ventilated along shafts that climb like secret trees through the levels, feeding rooms with measured air and giving fire a reliable exit. One of these vertical lungs drops roughly 55 meters and does double duty as a well, proof that redundancy is not extravagance but wisdom in a place where survival depends on systems that do more than one good thing. Wells are not simply holes in the ground, they are policies made visible, and some are deliberately disconnected from the surface so that a generous offer from above cannot turn into poison below, a rule written in water to protect the hours that must be lived without daylight. By isolating certain sources, the builders accepted a principle that governs the whole. When the world is uncertain, control your inputs, because clean air and clean water are not luxuries but the two sentences the city must finish every day. Heat and flame are domesticated with equal tact, with kitchens placed where drafts will draw smoke away and leave lungs unscorched, a choreography that lets bread rise in rooms that remain readable by lamplight. Even the niches for lamps are positioned as if light were a tool that deserved respect, smoothing brightness across stones so eyes do not strain and shadows do not swallow the edges where safety and purpose meet. Organization reads like a field manual for living well with limits, and stables occupy the upper levels because animals breathe better nearer the surface and can be led out quickly when the danger fades or the pasture calls. Deeper in the stack, spaces for learning, worship, and storage make a compact civilization out of precaution, turning necessity into culture without losing the thread that everything here must work or it does not belong. One large barrel-vaulted room on the second level is remembered as a school, not by a single inscription but by a clarity of scale and placement that suits instruction, a sign that minds were fed alongside bodies and that planning included the future's appetite for understanding. Far below, the cruciform church at the deepest accessible tier gathers the city's quiet into a shape of meaning, an altar of endurance proving that faith and engineering can share the same stone without competing for the same breath. Food is defended by design more than by locks, kept in rooms that stay dry because airflow behaves and moisture obeys floor grades that nudge water toward places where it can do no harm, all of it arranged so that supplies last and meals remain possible without constant worry. Presses for wine and oil, cellars and refectories, storage and workspaces form a circuit of calories and labor that respects the cost of error, because a spill here is more than a mess, it is a subtraction from time. Movement is never casual, it is counsel, and routes are planned to separate sparks from stores, noise from rest, animals from schools, and ritual from traffic, a distributed wisdom enforced not by signs but by shapes that make the right choice feel like the easy one. To walk here is to be taught by space, to be guided by slopes and corners that turn strangers into apprentices long before anyone issues a rule. Every threshold is a small negotiation with risk, and many of those negotiations end with a disc rolling home, a floor isolating itself, or a turn admitting only enough body to manage safely, the architecture insisting that caution is the only bravado worth indulging when lives depend on seconds measured by footsteps. In this city, a closed door is not an insult to courage but an investment in tomorrow, a way to make sure that a fright at noon does not end the story by nightfall. Depth is method, not dare, and the 18 levels drop toward quiet by about 85 meters, a descent paced by landings that let a community think while it moves, reset while it remembers, breathe while it decides what to do next. Vertical staircases begin partway down and gather the levels into a practical spine, binding the stack so that those who know it can relocate efficiently while those who do not are slowed to a manageable mystery. Defense also loves exit, and there are routes that serve as escapes or redistributions of pressure, lines that let a crowd become a community again by giving it options the way a river survives by finding more than one way around a rock. One tunnel on a deeper level is believed to run toward a neighboring underground city, a possibility that fits the regional logic of networks and redundancy even when the full path is not yet proved to be continuous in modern times. The uppermost entrances are often humble and embedded in ordinary life, openings that do not announce themselves to the casual eye, because invisibility is the first defense and anonymity the second, the opposite of a gate that dares an army to be impressed. Here, the surface disguises what the subsurface organizes, and the landscape above becomes a mask worn on behalf of the city below. The plan assumes fatigue and plans around it, moderating distances so that water is never too far from sleep and food is never too far from work, allowing care to continue when stamina thins and keeping mistakes from compounding in moments when vigilance has already been expensive. This is how infrastructure becomes kindness, turning a maze into a map and a crisis into a procedure. Sound is rationed like light, and rooms are shaped so a voice can cross without being raised, a courtesy that doubles as policy in a place where quiet is both comfort and concealment, the simplest way to avoid calling attention to what must not be found. When alarm is needed, the architecture knows how to help it travel. When calm is needed, the same curves and angles soften conversation until it becomes background rather than signal. The famous ventilation shaft that also draws water is placed where it can be defended and serviced, not a reckless opening but a managed artery, sealed from above when prudence demands and opened from within when the day allows. This is not a single trick but a theme, the folding of functions together so a system can survive failures by leaning on its other roles until repair is possible. Even the way thresholds where tells a security story, because smooth stone at a choke point implies watchfulness, 100 decisions to slow or separate that left Polish where surprise would have left damage, a difference you can feel with the sole of the foot. The city's memory is tactile, readable by hands on a door and feet on a stair, a braille of survival that remains legible even when the guide has finished speaking. When the surface presses down with weather or war, these rooms answer by becoming precise, their utility sharpened by pressure rather than dulled by it, and every redundancy becomes a kindness that spares a child a fear or a laborer an extra climb. And when the surface relents, the same precision relaxes into habit, the systems idle without breaking, the doors open without protesting, the city remembering how to be quiet without being asleep. The habit of sealing floors turns a siege into a series of local problems rather than a single catastrophe, letting a failure be contained, a mistake be forgiven, and a threat be met with a narrowed front that wastes as little breath as possible. In this way, the builders let the future borrow their caution, wrapping the unknown in a structure that assumes danger and refuses to be impressed by it. Placement of stables near the surface is not only about air, it is also about dignity and timing, because animals can be moved the moment the horizon is safe, allowing food and work to flow back into the daylight without disturbing the deeper order that keeps the city's heart steady. This upstairs-downstairs courtesy protects both species from turning necessity into nuisance, keeping the economy of effort clean. Below, the spaces for teaching and prayer keep minds in tempo with bodies, because a city that breathes well and eats well must also think well to survive its own caution, and nothing steadies a community like a room designed for attention and a room designed for meaning. The school's barrel vault and the church's cross-shaped gravity are not just functions, they are promises that the day will have a shape even when the sky is borrowed. Wine and oil presses speak of preservation as a virtue beyond survival, the transformation of raw harvest into enduring resource, and their presence confirms that planning here is not only about hiding from danger but about keeping the harvest generous long after the field goes quiet. Storage rooms flank this work with the coolness of stone and the obedience of measured air, keeping the future edible and the present calm. If the city feels deliberate, it is because every surface has been taught a job, and every job has been taught to support another, a lattice of purposes that refuses the fragility of single uses, preferring instead the composure that comes when everything is helpful twice. That is why Derinkuyu endures in the imagination without having to shout in the present, because usefulness is the loudest voice a city can have when noise is dangerous. Some corridors are tight enough to require the body to agree with the plan, a humility that makes defense intimate and efficient, the opposite of a parade ground where width is a boast and direction is a performance. Here, width is rationed and turns are earned, and an intruder's confidence is chipped away by the simple arithmetic of stone and breath. The belief that a long tunnel reaches toward Cappadocia underlines a regional logic: no city is wise alone, and redundancy loves neighbors, stitching a landscape into a quiet alliance that outlives rulers and remembers roots even when names change. Whether every meter is continuous today matters less than the principle it represents, that safe passage is a shared project and distance is a problem you solve in advance. Numbers support the temperament 18 levels, about 85 meters deep, a shaft about 55 meters drawing air and water, facts that do not claim perfection but offer scale, enough to anchor wonder without trapping it in slogans. These measures are the spine of the story, the part that stands straight while the rest moves, keeping the narrative honest when or threatens to run ahead of evidence. The capacity estimates, reaching toward 20,000 lives, are less about spectacle than about logistics, because such a count demands corridors that move, rooms that breathe, stores that last, and a rule set that keeps the few mistakes small and the many routines comfortable. Defense magnifies all of this by insisting that order be preserved when calm is threatened, the highest test of any system designed to outlast trouble. Notice how the city resists the temptation to dramatize danger, choosing instead to domesticate it, to fold risk into routines that look like housekeeping and feel like patience, because a community that can clean, cook, pray, learn, and sleep is a community already winning the argument with fear. In Derinkuyu, victory is the absence of panic, and the architecture exists to make that absence repeatable. Paths are chosen so that guardians can see without being seen and intervene without being theatrical, a restraint that keeps everyone's energy banked for what truly matters, because breath, water, and order are the only currencies that appreciate under siege. The stone remembers this lesson so thoroughly that modern visitors feel it without hearing it, guided by layouts that make good choices simple and bad choices awkward. The city's genius is not a trick but a temperament, a consistent preference for solutions that are strong because they are quiet, reversible because they are simple, and profound because they are kind to those who must use them every day. That is why the doors still roll, the shafts still draw, and the rooms still explain themselves in the low grammar of function, a language the body learns faster than the mind admits. When thinking turns to attack, the design answers with friction, narrowness, turns, closures, and when thinking turns to hunger or thirst, the design answers with proximity, wells where they are needed, stores where they are safe, fire where it is obedient, each response tuned to the speed at which worry travels. Worry is slowed, hunger is delayed, thirst is satisfied, and together these effects give time the chance to become an ally, which is the oldest aim of any defense worth the name. In this sense, Derinkuyu is a manual written in stone for the management of pressure, a set of practices that turns the exceptional into the procedural until even danger finds itself bored into retreat by a city that refuses to improvise when it can remember. Remembering, here, is the highest technology, and every carved edge is a stored instruction passed from hand to hand by the endurance of the material itself. The longer you pay attention, the more the distinctions blur between defense and hospitality, because the safest rooms are also the most comfortable, and the best ventilated corridors are also the pleasant ones to walk, and the quickest doors to seal are the gentlest to open once the moment passes. Good design doesn't specialize in fear here, it specializes in continuity, a steadiness that survives both drought and storm, invasion and rumor, crowd and solitude. If there is a final emphasis in the architecture, it is that control is distributed, never hoarded, a pattern where many small, sensible decisions add up to a city that does not need a single heroic action to endure, because the rooms themselves are heroes, the doors, the shafts, the turns, the grades. That is why the place still feels inhabited even when it is empty, because the systems continue to speak in the imperative of usefulness, a voice that does not fade when footsteps stop. And so the lesson stands: a city survives by teaching its materials to behave and its people to trust procedure, by placing courage in the wrist that rolls a stone into place and wisdom in the corridor that refuses to widen for pride, by letting air and water take their turns at the front lines while the rest of life continues without theatrics. Derinkuyu is not a bunker that glorifies fear, It is a home that supervises it, a deep grammar of safety that turns stone into patience and patience into time. When the door slides shut, the world narrows to what is necessary and kind, and when it opens, the world widens without forgetting what it learned in the dark, which is the truest defense of all, the only one that respects both the living and the days they hope to see. In that rhythm of closing and opening, of narrowing and widening, the city's architecture keeps its oath to make survival feel like life rather than like waiting, and that is how stone becomes a profoundly human thing. A city that survives must learn to breathe, and in Derinkuyu the air itself is an architecture, a lattice of shafts and corridors tuned so precisely that life could be folded 18 levels deep and still feel habitable rather than merely possible. Follow the breath and the plan appears, because long vertical shafts rise through the mass of stone like hidden trees, their trunks feeding rooms and passages with quiet currents that make fire obedient and sleep untroubled. One shaft in particular becomes a character rather than a feature, dropping roughly 55 meters into the depths and doubling as a well, a single column that carried both air and water and proved that redundancy here is not a luxury but the grammar of survival. Around that spine, more than 50 additional ventilation shafts distribute fresh air across the city's width, a network spread out to deny any attacker the satisfaction of a single point of failure and to ensure that smoke could find exits as faithfully as oxygen found entrances. The system is elegant because it is defensible, with a great well and its kin designed to be severed from above if the surface turned hostile, a practice that made clean water and safe air matters of internal choice rather than external mercy. Breath moves by differences: temperature, pressure, density, and the builders carved a pattern that lets those differences do the work, stacking rooms so that warm air rises toward shafts that will take it, while cooler air slips across floors to settle stoves and lungs alike. The stone becomes a moderator rather than a prison, its steady temperature smoothing the season so the shafts can manage flow without chaos, allowing life to proceed under a sky of rock as predictably as under a sky of weather. This is why capacity becomes plausible rather than rhetorical, because to shelter up to 20,000 people you must maintain air as a resource with the same seriousness as grain and water, and Derinkuyu's plan reads like a ledger that kept all three in circulation. Walk down from the upper levels and notice how air announces itself long before a breeze is felt, the way soot thins above ovens and lamp niches burn clean, a cleanliness born not of extravagance but of roots carved to ensure that waste goes where it should and breath goes where it must. Every corridor is part hallway and part duct, narrowing where velocity should rise, widening where a room needs calm, turning at right angles where smoke must lose its ambition and brightness should diffuse rather than glare. Even the famous rolling stone doors respect the lungs of the city, closing with a precision that denies intrusion without suffocating the rooms beyond, a seal that controls risks without cancelling respiration. Each floor could be closed off separately, which means air management was layered, not fragile, allowing a community to isolate a problem without endangering the whole, the architectural equivalent of a steady hand on a valve. Because the deepest accessible levels include a cruciform church and broad communal spaces, airflow had to be predictable enough for gatherings, and the presence of those spaces is a sign that the city trusted its lungs to carry voices, heat, and time without letting any of them become a threat. The large shaft carries water as well as air, and this pairing is more than convenience, it is strategy, because maintenance of one invites inspection of the other, and the path that a bucket learns is the same path a draft remembers. In a siege, the ability to cut the well from above is a way of converting knowledge into safety, a simple mechanism that turns an enemy's plan to poison into a futile inconvenience, an act of refusal done with the same modesty as closing a door. more than 50 shafts resist the fantasy of a single ventilator that would have made life fragile, and instead the city spreads risk the way a wise farmer spreads seed, across terrain rather than in a single line, trusting many small successes over one grand solution. This diffusion gives every room a share in the city's lungs, a fairness of breath that keeps alleyways from becoming stale and sleeping spaces from becoming burdens, letting routine push panic to the edges where it is easier to dismiss. The numbers power the narrative's calm, because 18 levels and roughly 85 meters of depth only make sense if the lungs can reach, and here they clearly do, as the shafts open like quiet windows at intervals that make distance an ally rather than an opponent. Even at the height of activity, when ovens are hot and workshops are practical, the air insists on order, drawing smoke upward, tucking drafts into corners where they serve rather than sabotage, and smoothing the path between waking and sleeping so the day's last lamps do not become a night's first worry. Air is also a form of etiquette in a city this close-knit, and the architecture teaches courtesy by keeping smells where they belong and letting warmth travel just far enough, so the presence of neighbors feels like comfort rather than crowding. Because animals share the upper levels, those tiers enjoy routes that clear the nose quickly and deliver fresher drafts first, a kindness to both species that also prepares evacuation if the pasture calls, reminding everyone that the city is a tool for living, not a cave for hiding. At the threshold to deeper rooms, the temperature steadies and the airflow softens, turning stairwells into lungs within lungs, places where bodies adjust and breath resets, the built equivalent of taking a moment before entering a quiet space. The shafts themselves vary in section and alignment, a practical diversity that keeps flow from becoming brittle, so that when one path is compromised, others carry the load without drama, a design principle that makes patience feel like strength. Because the well belongs to both the village above and the city below, it becomes the most eloquent example of shared infrastructure, and the ability to sever it from above is the most eloquent example of limits placed on sharing when survival requires it. Think of the system as a conversation between stone and need, because the tough yields to tools in shapes that reward the stack effect, vertical shafts for the rise of warm exhaust and lateral veining for cool supply, and Derinkuyu listens so carefully to these principles that the city seems to breathe on its own. Where rooms gather for instruction, the barrel vaults and curved ceilings marry acoustics with airflow, letting words travel on paths that heat and smoke have already learned, an economy of movement that makes a single lamp and a single voice serve many. In the church below, air moves with the same tact as sound, respecting the volume of the space without churning it, and the placement of openings keeps worship steady when weather above the ground would have made devotion a test of endurance. The plan places vents where they can be guarded from within, treating openings not as vulnerabilities but as responsibilities, which is why the city can close itself level by level without starving its lungs, a discipline that cares for both breathers and breaths. Tour accounts and institutional descriptions converge on the count that matters most for lungs, more than 50 ventilation shafts, some in the same structural run as wells and staircases, others stepping aside to feed specific rooms, all of them pieces in a chorus that raises oxygen from statistic to comfort. Even when corridors operate as security bottlenecks, they do not become respiratory bottlenecks, because their constriction is matched by deliberate openings at the right intervals, a compromise that slows intruders while it speeds the air, a balancing act written into the rock. The habit of sealing floors means air management is local when it must be, and persistent when it can be, a flexibility that turns crisis into a choreography rather than a scramble, keeping breath available wherever the day has decided people must go. Because lamps and ovens live by drafts, niches and hearths find their places where the shafts listen, a partnership that lets heat be a blessing without becoming a bully, and soot stains read like footnotes in the margins of a well-kept manual. Maintenance joins design as an equal partner in a lung's success, and the same paths that carry air carry caretakers, hands that inspect the walls and lips of openings, ears that recognize a healthy whisper from an anxious rush, and bodies that know when to slow a flame or open a turn. Above ground, the shafts hide in plain sight, their mouths disguised by ordinary features or placed where curiosity is unlikely, a choice that protects the city's breath from tampering in the same way rolling doors protect its people from intrusion. When guides speak of smokers watching their exhalations vanish into the shaft, the image holds because the system was designed to prefer clarity over accumulation, to make waste a traveler rather than a tenant, and to make every room sit in a stream rather than a pool. The coupling of well and vent answers the oldest question of life below ground: what happens when the sky refuses to help? And Derinkuyu's answer is always the same: design takes over where chance fails, and habit enforces what design intends. Numbers return as reassurances rather than boasts: 18 levels, about 85 meters of depth, more than 50 shafts, a primary well vent dropping roughly 55 meters, a capacity that rises plausibly to 20,000 because air and water were made obedient before people were asked to be. In the routines of the day, airflow becomes invisible again, proof that the city is working, because in a system like this trouble is noisy and calm is quiet, and Derinkuyu's quiet is the best kind, the kind that smells like bread and oil and the simple rest of lungs that do not need to think. If defense is a choreography of slowing threats, ventilation is a choreography of speeding comfort, and the two dances overlap without strain, because the same turns and closures that confound hostility are paced so that oxygen never loses its way. The deeper the descent, the more obvious the coordination becomes, and the more remarkable it feels that stone cut by hand could be so humane, so gentle to breathers, and so stubborn to trouble, a temperament that feels modern without needing to be modern. Every lesson the lungs teach is a lesson about trust, trust in the rock to hold its shape, in the shaft to keep its promise, in the door to close without punishing those it protects, and in the habit of inspection that turns knowledge into safety one glance at a time. To say the city breathes is not metaphor here, it is measurement, a fact written in the count of shafts and the length of the well, in the capacity of rooms and the routes of smoke, in the simple observation that thousands can live together only if the air is fair to each. This is why the rediscovery felt like the removal of a cork, air rushing into memory, memory rushing into air, and why the modern path respects the lungs by limiting crowds and pacing visits, so the system that worked for centuries is not undone by admiration. Look up from any landing and the shaft is a slice of day, and look down from any lip and the shaft is a ribbon of depth, and between these two views lies the truth of Derinkuyu's lungs. They connect the city not only to the surface but to itself, level to level, room to room, breath to breath. If survival here feels serene rather than desperate, credit the air, because it turns a refuge into a home and a strategy into a culture, teaching people to live with restraint that feels like ease and to accept limits that feel like care. The last proof is the simplest: the doors can close and the lights can dim and the city can go quiet without growing stale, and when the doors open again the air feels the same, patient and prepared, a soft certainty that the lungs did their work while no one was watching. So the city's breath becomes the listener's guide, and following it reveals why this depth is gentle, why this number of people is believable, and why a single shaft can carry the double burden of water and wind, because in Derinkuyu design and atmosphere are the same story told in two elements. At the center of that story stands the 55-meter column that is both well and windpipe, a vertical promise that the city will not suffocate or thirst, and along its flanks the chorus of more than 50 openings keeps the promise plural so it can be kept for a long time. The rest is attention and respect, the daily work of keeping paths clear and flames right-sized, of listening for the difference between a draft and a leak, and of trusting that the stone will continue to answer the same questions with the same patience it has already shown for centuries. When night falls above and the underground rooms take on their own kind of dusk, the lungs do not change their pace or tone, and that constancy is the point, because endurance is a rhythm before it is a wall, and here the rhythm is air. What begins as engineering becomes atmosphere, and what begins as atmosphere becomes a way of thinking that reaches beyond the city that taught it, a lesson in how to make the necessary feel graceful and how to let breath carry the weight so that people do not have to. And that is how Derinkuyu teaches a final kindness. It lends its lungs to anyone who enters, offering the same measured calm to a stranger with a lamp that it once gave to a family with a lifetime, reminding both that safety here is made, maintained, and shared. Water is the city's second heartbeat after air, and in Derinkuyu the two share the same anatomy, with a deep primary shaft that serves as both windpipe and well, making breath and drink arrive by the same guarded path so survival never depends on luck alone. Follow the sound of a bucket lowering and you are also following the movement of air, because the large vertical shaft drops roughly 55 meters and was engineered to give the underground community access to water at depth while also carrying the city's exhalations upward in a steady, predictable draft. This is not a single-point gamble but a designed redundancy wrapped in stone, because more than 50 ventilation shafts are distributed across the complex to spread risk, while the primary well runs deep enough to be useful in crisis and gentle enough in daily life to integrate with corridors, kitchens, and sleeping areas without drama. The logic is blunt and beautiful: distribute the lungs so no single failure can choke the city, and center the well where it can be supplied under pressure and defended without spectacle, a plan that lets thousands drink and breathe while the world above forgets there is a city below. Protection extends to purity, and tradition and survey agree that some wells do not connect to the surface at all, a deliberate isolation that makes poisoning from above an empty gesture and preserves clean water as a decision made from within rather than a hope placed in strangers. The depth and placement of the main shaft make its dual use credible and wise, because a column that moves smoke also invites light and care, and a route that draws air also disciplines how water is fetched and guarded, giving the city two essentials in one defensible line. Above ground, mouths of shafts can hide in the ordinary landscape, and below ground, doorways and windows open onto the vertical run at intervals that serve stairs, rooms, and landings, so water and air become neighbors instead of rivals, a collaboration written into each level's shape. When the sky turns hostile, the city turns inward, and accounts describe the well as cuttable from below, a capability that flips vulnerability into policy, allowing inhabitants to sever external access without losing internal supply and making purity a function of courage instead of fortune. This is how a capacity estimate moves from myth to math, because a community of up to 20,000 only works if water flow and air flow are kept sovereign under stress, and Derinkuyu's pattern shows both resources disciplined by access control, redundancy, and the smoothing effect of steady stone temperatures. Food systems fold into this hydrology, with wine and oil presses, refectories, and storage rooms arranged where drafts, dryness, and proximity to water support the work without inviting mold, flame, or fatigue, a network designed to conserve human effort as carefully as it conserves calories. In practice this means fires were placed where air would draw smoke away cleanly and leave water's freshness untroubled, and it means storage sat where the coolness of tuff and the obedience of airflow kept grain and jars steady while nearby wells could answer kitchen rhythms without waste. The large shaft anchors this choreography, and guides describe how smoke vanishes quickly as it meets the rise, while light dwindles to a bright speck at depth, an image that explains why the same vertical design can host a rope and a bucket without making life below feel suffocated or damp. Because some shafts and wells are intentionally disconnected from the surface, the city keeps its own counsel about when to draw and when to seal, making siege behavior a set of rehearsed moves rather than a chaotic improvisation, and keeping water as a trusted ally rather than a contested prize. The distribution of more than 50 shafts works like insurance across the map, each opening pairing with lateral passages to serve clusters of rooms, so families, kitchens, and workshops share a predictable climate where steam, soot, and breath never gather in the wrong place for long. This layout protects dignity as well as health, because water can travel short, regular routes to the tasks that need it: washing, cooking, brewing, pressing, reducing the friction of life underground and letting routine carry more weight than fear when doors have to close. The deep well-esque connection to both the village above and the city below is a story of sharing with a safety net, because the same vertical resource serves two communities in ordinary times, while the underground side retains the right to isolate itself when danger rises, a rare case where fairness and caution agree. Numbers here are a comfort rather than a boast. The city reaches roughly 85 meters down across 18 levels, feeds itself with more than 50 ventilation shafts, and drinks from a primary well dropping about 55 meters, a triad that makes extended habitation plausible instead of poetic. Even the accessible sections remind visitors that what they see is a fraction, and that the water story scales with the city's unseen rooms, but enough is present to witness how shafts intersect with doorways and landings, and how chamber placement respects the difference between moisture that helps and moisture that harms. Because wine and oil presses live alongside refectories and stores, water's role extends beyond thirst, supporting preservation and communal meals that keep morale and metabolism aligned, and the presence of these facilities proves that planning did not stop at survival but continued to culture. At ritual centers, from the barrel-vaulted schoolroom to the cruciform church in the deepest accessible tier, the atmosphere remains measured and breathable, a sign that ventilation and water management were tuned to keep gatherings safe, steady, and dignified even when the city relied entirely on what lay within. The city's name itself reinforces the primacy of depth in water, with local tradition linking Derinkuyu deep well to the vertical reality of a system that lets life ride a rope down a single guarded line, then fan out across rooms where air has already practiced being kind. Operators of the present echo the wisdom of the past by pacing visitation, because crowds are pressure on both lungs and wells, and the site stays healthy when paths are moderated and rooms are allowed to rest, a modern stewardship that continues the policy of protecting breath and water first. In this balance, the shafts are not merely tubes but teachers, showing how a small temperature difference can be multiplied by height into a reliable current, and how the same height turns a bucket's descent into a ritual of trust repeated safely across seasons. Descriptions from the region emphasize how shafts perform 5 services: air, light, transport, communication, and water, and while guests feel those roles as sensations, the city knew them as necessities, braiding them so one maintenance path could serve several life-saving duties without confusion. Even when corridors narrow for defense, the city refuses to let water and air become casualties of caution, because openings are placed where flow can slip past closures, and levels can be sealed without suffocating the daily work of kitchens and stores that depend on a draft. The principle is constant: isolate exposure, not essentials, and teach a door to defend while a shaft continues to serve, a design ethic that turns siege into inconvenience and routine into authority, with the well as the calmest voice in the room. Local summaries and institutional notes agree on the distribution: more than 50 ventilation shafts, a principal well around 55 meters, and a plan that lets inhabitants cut external access from below, each fact describing a city that refused to leave the most fragile variables in someone else's hands. Because wine and oil presses require predictable climate and clean water nearby, their presence doubles as an audit of hydrology, confirming that airflow, temperature, and moisture were managed well enough to support processing and storage rather than merely survival. The well's alignment through multiple levels also anchors wayfinding, offering orientation where light is rationed, and its verticality becomes a moral in stone. When in doubt, go toward the line that keeps you alive, because it is the one feature that serves everyone equally at every hour. Not every opening answers to the sky, and that deliberate choice keeps the underground sovereign, breaking the simplest sabotage while preserving the simplest routines, a philosophy that treats purity as a system outcome rather than a prayer. The city's lungs and water routes work together to make cleanliness easy and staleness hard, so that soot stains move toward shafts, steam doesn't settle where grain rests, and the bucket path doesn't cross a corridor that would sour the air. Small mercies multiplied into durable comfort. When the doors roll shut, the well becomes the most eloquent proof that isolation here is not isolation from life, and when the doors open, the same well becomes a shared resource again, the architecture remembering that community above and below are neighbors in ordinary time. Capacity figures stop feeling like slogans when placed next to this plumbing of air and water, because the difference between overcrowding and community is measured by how quickly a bucket comes back full and how quietly a flame continues to listen, and Derinkuyu scores well on both measures. The stone's coolness steadies water just as it steadies breath, flattening the season so that the city's metabolism stays calm, and visitation notes today still comment on how efficiently smoke is drawn and air remains fresh deep below, a living demonstration of old decisions still working. Even the rumor of tunnels toward neighboring underground cities fits the logic of distributed lifelines, because a landscape that shares knowledge often shares roots, and water follows not only gravity but wisdom when communities decide to link what must endure. Guides who pause at a shaft mouth are really pausing at a thesis, inviting a look upward where day is a thumbnail and downward where the city's confidence is carved, and the lesson is the same from both directions: survival is organized, not improvised. Wine and oil speak of feasts that could be remembered rather than postponed, and a refectory beside a storage room speaks of meals that could be served rather than rationed into silence, each scene dependent on water arriving clean and leaving discreetly. For all its poetic power, the well remains a tool first, and the shafts remain instruments, and that insistence on usefulness is the city's most humane trait, because a system that works quietly lets people live loudly in the ways that matter, even when they choose to speak softly. That is the gift of Derinkuyu's water story. It turns depth into certainty, interiority into generosity, and the relationship between a rope and a bucket into a compact between generations, one that says safety will be built, maintained, and shared as long as the stone can hold a line. When air and water travel together, the room feels honest, and when a city commits to that honesty across 18 levels, it becomes a place where numbers 50 shafts, 55 meters, 85 meters, 20,000 people sound less like claims and more like the outline of a life that truly happened. Stand at the edge of the well and listen, and the echo is not a mystery calling from below but a system confirming from within, a soft repetition that says the same thing in every language of survival: breathe, drink, keep going, the design is ready for you. Even now, careful management mirrors the old rules, because gates, group sizes, and resting periods keep the room's atmosphere as humane for visitors as it once was for inhabitants, guarding the balance that lets the shafts and well perform without strain. The deeper the descent, the simpler the truth becomes. This place works because air and water were taught to cooperate, and because both were given doors they could ignore, schedules they could keep, and paths they could hold, a courtesy extended to elements before it was extended to people. If memory is a current, then the well is where it surfaces, and if patience is a climate, then the shafts are how it circulates, and together they explain why a city can hide for centuries without wilting and then return without needing to be explained twice. So the water of Derinkuyu is not simply wetness but judgment, a test the city passes every hour by remaining clean, reachable, and its own, and a reminder that the most generous infrastructure is the kind that keeps the essentials invisible until someone needs them. In the quiet after a bucket rises, the lamp steadies, the voices soften, and the room returns to its low, dependable weather, and that feeling is the signature of the entire plan, life proceeding with grace because water and air have already agreed on how to help. That agreement, carved into tough and proven by time, is why the story still feels present, and why the well still feels like a promise kept rather than a relic admired, a working line between now and then that anyone can understand by touching the rope. And if the city had one message to send upward through that shaft, it would be that endurance is a practice made of elements and choices, and that the simplest elements, guided by the wisest choices, can make a home where others can only imagine a hideout. Daily life underground is not a compromise here, it is a craft, and the measure of that craft is how quietly systems dissolve into routine until breathing, eating, learning, praying, working, and sleeping flow through the same stone without tugging at each other. Rooms are carved to be homes first and shelters second, set along corridors that double as gentle ducts so that a lamp can glow without smothering a neighbor and a conversation can carry without burden, making community feel like comfort rather than crowding. The amenities list reads like the index of a town rather than a hideout: wine and oil presses, stables, cellars, storage rooms, refectories, and chapels, each one a quiet anchor for tasks that repeat daily and seasonally until habit feels like heritage. Near the surface, animals hold their place with dignity, close to exits and to stronger drafts, so their breath stays sweet and their paths are short when pasture or safety calls them back above, proving that the city's care extends to every life that keeps it alive. Food begins with fire and air, and kitchens are positioned so smoke finds the shafts as naturally as bread finds the table, a choreography that lets hunger be answered without turning oxygen into a gamble, and lets warmth linger where bodies gather. Grain rests in rooms that stay cool and dry because the stone keeps a steady temper and the passages keep a steady breeze, so stores last, waste shrinks, and every meal becomes the closing of a circle drawn days or months earlier in a field above. Presses for wine and oil turn harvest into endurance, and their presence says the same thing the sellers say: this is not an address for emergencies alone, it is a plan to keep flavor and light kept in jars, ready to feed appetite and spirit through long intervals. At meal times the refectory is the city's heartbeat, a place where the predictable climate and predictable flow let bodies and voices settle, where a shared table turns precaution into companionship and the day's work returns to patience. Education has its own room and rhythm, signaled by a spacious barrel-vaulted hall on the second floor remembered as a school, with studies nearby, a pairing that proves the city gave the future a seat even when the present demanded vigilance. Instruction benefits from the same physics as cooking and prayer, because vaults that carry sound kindly also accept air kindly, making a lesson travel without a shout and making thinking feel like rest rather than strain. Devotion gathers at depth, where a cruciform church waits on the lowest accessible level, and the fact that breath and temperature remain steady there confirms that the city's lungs were tuned as carefully for reverence as for work. Light is not squandered, and lamp niches are cut where a flame can be sheltered but generous. Reflectors of pale stone make the most of a small wick, and the absence of glare protects eyes that must pay attention long after the sun has been traded for silence. The same rolling stone doors that defend also curate daily flow, closing floors when needed without starving them, keeping a family's quiet intact while a corridor is secured, and letting rest be real even when caution is close. Children grow up learning the map by feel, by the incline of a floor that tells water where to go, by the cooling of air that tells a stair is near, by the hush that says a chapel is close, and this embodied literacy turns space into the first teacher. Work divides by proximity and purpose, with noisy tasks where sound can be absorbed, with sparks far from stores, with cooking near drafts, with storage near calm, and with animals close to exits, a civil arrangement enforced not by signs but by sense. Because more than 50 ventilation shafts lace the rooms, chores can run on schedule in any season, and a kitchen fire at dusk does not slow a lesson nearby or a prayer deeper in, each space breathing with the whole without competing for breath. The principal shaft that doubles as a well stitches levels together like a vertical plaza, a place where a bucket's rope becomes a metronome for the day and a draft's whisper becomes a reassurance that the city's pulse is steady. Some wells are insulated from the surface, a deliberate boundary that makes purity a local certainty and keeps water as the community's sovereign resource even when the horizon is unkind, a quiet policy that turns a vulnerability into a valve. Families arrange themselves in clusters of rooms that share edges without surrendering privacy, and corridors act as porches as much as streets, receiving talk and footsteps with equal patience and never forcing strangers into intimacy. In the steady climate below, laundry dries on a predictable schedule, food ferments and ages as planned, tools respond to a known range of moisture and temperature, and the absence of surprise is an economy unto itself. Rules live in the layout more than in any proclamation. Keep loud work where curves and corners tame it, keep hot work where a shaft will escort it, keep sleeping where footsteps soften, and keep gathering where air and acoustics agree to be kind. Seasonal rhythms ride this constancy rather than wrestle with it, so winter above becomes a faint suggestion below and summer's glare becomes a rumor, giving the city a calendar that refuses to argue with weather while still answering to harvest and rest. Commerce in a place like this is mostly exchange of labor and favor, and the presses, storage niches, refectories, and classrooms form a circuit where hands are busy without waste, because the plan makes waste difficult and contribution easy. Safety drills are simply daily habits done attentively, a door rolled and unrolled to keep wrists confident, a lamp trimmed and placed to keep memory fresh, a stair counted by steps to keep bodies honest, all of it woven into chores rather than staged as theater. When talk turns to capacity, it is really talk about pace, because a town that can plausibly host up to 20,000 does so by preventing bottlenecks in kitchens, at wells, in sleep, and at worship, and by making every essential available without pilgrimage. Children learn where the church breathes best and where a whisper carries, where to step on a landing and when to wait at a door, and those lessons make them citizens more than any oath could, their competence a gift that requires no announcement. Emptying refuse and stewarding water are the invisible chores that keep the city visible to itself, and the architecture gives cues that make the right choices obvious, turning sanitation from strain into sequence. A home here is a negotiated space where every niche has a task, every ledge a meaning, and every wall's curve a promise that time will not be wasted, and that promise gives sleep a dignity that is rare in any age. The refectory's meal is a policy meeting by another name, because seating, serving, and cleaning are acts of governance done with gentleness, and the way a room cushions sound is the way a city cushions fatigue. Devotion does not ask for spectacle when the cruciform room already holds a quiet grandeur, and the knowledge that the church's air is as steady as the refectory's warmth turns faith into a daily confidence rather than a festival. Wine and oil presses are neighbors to the sacred without competing with it, because preservation of harvest is itself a devotion to continuity, and the arrangement reflects a world view where usefulness is the most pious decoration. Animal care near the top layers lets dawn be honest, with hooves moving toward pasture when peace permits, and it keeps smell and stress from sinking into the deeper rooms where children learn and elders rest. Workshop tasks live where drafts and temperature make fire obedient and edges safe, and the stair that begins deeper down is paced to keep fatigue from turning into clumsiness, a consideration that protects hands and stone equally. The famous rolling doors are part of daily etiquette, not only wartime reflexes, because they can hush a corridor for sleep or study as readily as they can deny a stranger the same motion serving a different kind of peace. Because shafts are many and well distributed, a candle flame tells the truth in every room, and cooks learn to anticipate an evening draw while teachers learn to assume a morning clarity, timekeeping done by sensation rather than by clock. Stewardship is shared and constant, a hand checks a vent lip for dust, another listens for a change in a draft, another watches a well for clarity, and these small attentions are the tax paid for a life that does not waste attention on avoidable crises. Lamps are tools and rituals at once, and their placement preserves vision while refusing glare, so faces remain gentle at night and rooms remain legible, and the entries in the suit ledger remain neat and predictable. On a typical day the routes between kitchen, well, store, and refectory make a small circuit whose efficiency is the city's true wealth, measured in steps saved and in breaths kept easy, an economy of motion intended to last. A lesson begins with the teacher standing where the vault agrees, where a word crosses a room intact and returns as understanding, and the same geometry that makes sound travel makes worry slow down, an educational infrastructure built of calm. The church's depth makes devotion intimate and protective, turning prayer into a shelter within a shelter, and confirming that spiritual life here is not a retreat from reality but a refinement of it. Visitors today still feel the calm of that arrangement, remarking on the cool, constant air and the efficiency with which smoke leaves and breath arrives, a living endorsement of design decisions made when lives depended on them. When children race along a corridor and then stop at a turn because the room beyond asks for quiet, the architecture has done its work, making good manners the path of least resistance and turning instruction into instinct. Storage rooms speak softly of discipline, shelves placed where drafts do not tease flour into clumps or oil into impatience, where the night needs no supervision beyond the confidence that morning will find things as they were left. Tasks that require water live near the well's logic rather than its romance, and the bucket's arc is short enough to resist spill and long enough to share dignity, so drudgery never wins the argument against usefulness. At the end of a day, closures happen without drama. One floor calms while another remains social, a door hushes while a stair continues to accept steps, and the city demonstrates that safety is a gradient, not a switch. If there is a single sentence for everyday life here, it is that everything is in its place for a reason, and the reasons agree with each other, so that no task harms another and no comfort steals from a neighbor. Animals sleep, lamps dim, voices narrow to a murmur, the shafts keep their slow conversation with the sky, and the well guards its clarity, each element doing what it was taught to do so the people can do what they hope to do tomorrow. Morning begins whenever duty calls rather than when sunlight insists, and the predictability of air and water makes the first footsteps unhurried, the first tasks achievable, and the first words gentle. By threading learning, worship, eating, working, storing, and resting through a layout that never asks a system to fight itself, Derinkuyu makes a philosophy out of quiet efficiency, and that philosophy is the true author of its daily peace. It is tempting to call this ordinary, but ordinary at this scale is extraordinary, and the proof is that centuries later the rooms still explain themselves, the doors still teach patience, and the shafts still keep their promises as if habit were a kind of love. The last sound of the evening is the smallest rope on wood, breath at rest, a lamplight surrendering to darkness, and beneath that softness runs the same certainty heard in the first paragraph: life here proceeds because the city was designed to let it, and everyone knows their part. The question of authorship opens like a door that does not swing on a single hinge, because the city bears many hands and many hours, and what is known, with care, is that its earliest phases likely belong to the Iron Age Phrygians, while later centuries, especially the Byzantine era, expanded and refined what the stone had begun, leaving a layered work whose purpose matured under pressure. Evidence for a Phrygian start rests on time, place, and habit. Since the 8th–7th centuries BCE saw a Phrygian presence capable of cutting and organizing rock at scale, with a cultural bent for monumentalizing stone that could easily extend downward when the surface offered both inspiration and danger. Against this plausible beginning stands an older rumor of Hittite involvement, a suggestion that some first levels might be late bronze in spirit if not in certainty, yet the balance of scholarship keeps returning to the Phrygian window for an origin robust enough to anchor a city that would be entrusted to others. A fragment from classical literature helps confirm antiquity if not authorship, because Xenophon in the 4th century BCE wrote of subterranean dwellings in Anatolia arranged for storage, life, and safety. A passage that does not name Derinkuyu yet mirrors its logic so closely that the echo feels like recognition across time. Purpose follows authorship like a shadow follows a figure, and here the consensus is steady. These spaces were shaped as temporary havens in a land where dominant powers changed with exhausting regularity, a policy of dissent practiced most intensively during the Byzantine centuries when Arab raids and frontier anxieties made refuge a civic virtue rather than a last resort. The daily calm that earlier parts have traced breath, water, storage, doors, roots becomes, in this frame, a long rehearsal for short notice, a city that can be populated quickly, sealed level by level, and sustained for as long as it takes for tide and rumor to turn, a choreography designed for prudence rather than spectacle. This does not exclude other uses, and in truth the city's earliest chapters may have been storage-led, folding grain, oil, and wine into the earth where cool, dry stability extended the harvest, an economical instinct that later became a safety system once borders, armies, and persecutions demanded a deeper patience. By the time the Byzantine period turned caution into custom, the underground life had a full grammar stables near the surface, kitchens near obedient drafts, storage deeper down, schools and chapels placed where air and acoustics agreed, and the population could swell to the famous estimate only because design had already made such swelling survivable. Religious history sharpened the need, and Greek-speaking Christians learned the route below not as a surrender but as a strategy, a way to meet Roman suspicion in late antiquity and later to outlast the cycles of violence that marked the Arab-Byzantine wars between the late 8th and late 12th centuries, when concealment bought time and time preserved community. The city's architecture proves purpose as clearly as any chronicle, because rolling stone doors that close from within, corridors that thin where force would otherwise widen, and a well that can be severed from the sky all make sense only if the desired outcome is ordered survival under stress. If the 14th century added Mongol fear to the ledger and the Ottoman centuries added new reasons to disappear and reappear, the city did not need to change its mind to answer them. It simply repeated what it already knew, that air must be fair, water must be sovereign, and movement must be wise. Authorship, then, is better described as stewardship across eras, with Phrygian beginnings, Roman and early Christian adaptation, Byzantine systematization, and later use that proves durability rather than authorship, a succession that makes the city less a monument to a builder than a testimony to a culture of carefulness. The idea that early Christians were the primary makers is too narrow but not without truth, because while many features reflect their needs and their confidence in concealment, the bones of the place point further back and the lungs of the place were tuned by anyone who ever lowered a lamp and listened for a draught. Attributing the city solely to the Hittites stretches the evidence beyond comfort, yet refusing their possible role in early excavation ignores the reality that Anatolian traditions of rock-cut refuge predate the Iron Age, an ambiguity best handled by acknowledging contributions without forcing a single signature. Function clarifies authorship by revealing an ethic, the ethic of redundancy and restraint, of shafts that are many instead of singular, of wells that can be defended from within, of doors that close quietly, of rooms that never load a neighbor with inconvenience, all pointing to a people for whom survival was a craft, not an exception. The BBC's synthesis captures the curve of use neatly: storage at first, refuge at need, maximal dependence during the waves of 7th century Islamic raids on a Byzantine frontier already accustomed to threat, an arc where tempers were tested and the design kept passing. That curve makes the true purpose less sensational and more humane, because the city exists to hold life steady when the horizon is noisy, to transform a regional habit of hiding into a civic form of care, and to make the absence of panic repeatable by design rather than by luck. Multiple communities added chapters to the same manual, and the presence of chapels, schools, presses, stables, and refectories confirms that the underground choice was never purely tactical, it was cultural, capable of hosting families with continuity rather than merely concealing bodies until a danger passed. If some seasons drove people below for climate as much as for conflict, winter sharpened by plateau winds, summer pressed by heat, the architecture welcomes this gentler motive without contradiction, because the same shafts, wells, and rooms that steady siege also steady seasons. What a modern visitor meets is the residue of coordinated intentions, a city begun in one era, apprenticed through several, practiced most intensely when faith and empire collided, and preserved by the hearts and hands that treated every lamp as both a tool and a promise. Theories that point to Persians or later Seljuks as primary authors tell truths about occupation and expansion, but the bones remain older, and the way rooms speak aligns best with Phrygian and Byzantine pages in the region's long book, with others scribbling margins rather than drafting the first line. Connectivity, whether literal tunnels to Kaymakal or simply a shared language of forms, reinforces that no single polity owned the idea, because Cappadocia's underground cities are a family of solutions tuned to similar fears and similar stones, a regional mind expressed in many mouths. The practical genius of sealing floors from within, isolating wells from above, and distributing more than 50 shafts across a depth of roughly 85 meters confirms that the why preceded the who in importance, that purpose steered authorship as much as authorship defined purpose. When the 20th century's population exchanges closed a chapter, they did not cancel the argument of the rooms, and the city's reopening in the 1960s simply allowed that argument to be heard again, that endurance is a pattern, and that people are at their safest when patterns are kind. So the true builders are those who accepted constraint as a teacher, who place stables high, worship deep, lessons where voices travel, stores where drafts behave, doors where decisions are honest, and wells where purity outlives rumor and that acceptance has no single date. Purpose, likewise, has no single mask, because it is refuge, storage, climate moderation, devotion, instruction, and order, with refuge simply the tightest grouping of all those motives when history demands that they be held together without gaps. To reduce the city to an emergency bunker is to ignore the dignity of the refectory and the calm of the church. To reduce it to a cool storage complex is to ignore the vigilance of the doors. The truth lies exactly where the rooms meet, in a life that can continue when the surface cannot. In this light, the Phrygians begin the sentence, early Christians refine its clauses, the Byzantine centuries test its grammar, and later ages annotate the margins with uses as necessary as breath, until the sentence becomes a paragraph that only ends when the horizon is finally quiet. The final humility is that mystery remains a partner, because sealed corridors and undecided chambers do not weaken the argument but protect it, reminding everyone that a city built to survive should not be forced to explain everything to be believed. And so authorship resolves into character more than into name, and purpose resolves into practice more than into slogan, both visible in the same habits: air kept generous, water kept sovereign, movement kept wise, faith kept calm, food kept ready, doors kept answerable from within. What survives is not only stone but the discipline carved into it, a discipline that outlasts assumptions about who first held the chisel, and that tells any listener willing to descend that the truest signature here is a design that still works. Across Cappadocia the story widens from a single refuge to a landscape of linked habitations, with UNESCO recognizing a cultural terrain that explicitly includes the subterranean cities of Cappadocia and Derinkuyu alongside rock-hewn villages, sanctuaries, and valleys carved by time and tough. This broader frame matters because it shows how an underground city gains strength from neighbors, with the volcanic plateau between Nevşehir, Ürgüp, and Avanos hosting dense clusters of troglodyte dwellings and towns designed to fold entire communities out of sight when history demanded quiet. In that constellation, Cappadocia stands close enough to feel like kin to Derinkuyu, and the record describes an 8-9 kilometers tunnel connection between them, a claim that captures the region's confidence in redundancy whether or not every meter remains continuous or accessible today. Even modern guides repeat the proximity and the idea of linkage, noting the two sites sit only about 10 kilometers apart and are somewhat connected, a phrasing that preserves both the allure of a direct corridor and the practical truth that much remains sealed or unsafe for public passage. Step back further and the count of underground settlements grows beyond a handful, with regional tallies speaking of more than 100 such places, only a few open to visitors, and traditions asserting that many surface homes once tied directly into subsurface networks through private tunnels. This density is not an accident, it is a policy echoed in UNESCO's inscription, which speaks of troglodyte villages and subterranean towns as a traditional human habitat dating back to the 4th century, then banding together into refuges during periods of Arab-Byzantine conflict when safety and worship needed roofs of stone. What binds the network is not only rock and fear but a shared grammar of solutions, visible in rolling millstone doors, ventilation shafts laced through rooms and corridors, and layouts that mix stables, kitchens, storage, schooling, and prayer, so that survival and culture travel together even when distance separates towns. The contrast between Derinkuyu and Cappadocia sharpens that grammar without breaking it, because Derinkuyu descends in depth while Cappadocia spreads in breadth, and together they illustrate how a regional language can be spoken with different accents to meet specific terrain and community needs. Cappacocia's description makes the kinship obvious, laying out stables on the first level, a church on the second, storage and presses on the third, and expansive jar rooms on the fourth, each zone wrapped around ventilation shafts that double as the spine of circulation and the guarantee of breathable time. That arrangement mirrors Derinkuyu's ethic of placing animals nearer the surface, worshipping controlled air at depth, and stores where drafts behave, making it clear that networked resilience comes from repeating good ideas rather than inventing fragile tricks. When one site seals levels to survive a raid, the others can receive displaced families or share provisions later, and this is how a network behaves even when a literal tunnel is not walked, because compatibility of design and habit is a bridge as real as stone. UNESCO's brief synthesis ties the fabric together with monastic threads, tracing small anchoritic cells in the 4th century that grew into villages and subterranean towns, a pattern where religious and practical motives fused into a system that could withstand invasion without discarding daily life. Byzantine centuries tested the system, and the archaeological and textual memory preserved at Kaymakal confirms that these underground cities were expanded and used as protection during the long arc of Arab-Byzantine wars, knitting local communities into a defensive ecology rather than isolating them in panic. The Kaymakal page retains a social memory that reaches into the 20th century, recording how Rum communities still retreated underground during episodes of violence, proof that the network's value outlasted empires and that shared habits matter more than borders when the horizon turns uncertain. It helps to see the region's settlements as nodes rather than forts, each node fluent in the same architecture of restraint so that people could move between them when necessary, and each one capable of closing quietly and reopening cleanly so trade, harvest, and worship could resume without rebuilding trust from scratch. That is why the catalogue of Cappadocia's subterranean places keeps lengthening, with guides acknowledging more than 100 underground settlements and observing that only a handful are open, a reminder that a network can be larger than what is mapped and still be legible to those who live within it. Within the UNESCO inscription, the subterranean towns stand beside hundreds of rock-hewn sanctuaries, showing how faith and refuge coexisted and strengthened each other, and how the artistic record of the post-iconoclastic period layered meaning into the same stone that also held water, air, and warmth. When present-day routes bring visitors first to Derinkuyu and then to Kaymakal, the path doubles as a lesson in network design, unveiling a vertical city that can seal by floor and a horizontal city that can distribute flow laterally, different strategies serving the same promise of time and calm. Where a literal tunnel is documented, it is worth treating it as emblem rather than as the whole, because the 8-9 kilometers connection described for Kaymakal and Derinkuyu represents one strong line in a fabric also woven by shared techniques, shared rituals, and shared logistics repeated across many addresses. The UNESCO management notes even register these towns as part of a single protected cultural zone, calling for integrated planning that respects how people, stone, and sanctuaries form one system whose values cannot be protected in pieces without weakening the whole. Names beyond the famous pair Ozkanak, Tatlarin, Marzi, Saratal appear in regional lists that emphasize breadth, and while not every site rises to the scale of a city, the smaller nodes multiply options and absorb pressure in the same way many ventilation shafts spread the risk of a single failure. It is telling that Kaymakal's public narrative stresses that only a fraction is open, because networks endure by leaving some capacity untapped and some corridors unexposed, and this reserve keeps the story honest about what remains to be understood without inviting damage. Across the plateau, the geology supplies the link, with tuff soft enough to cut and strong enough to keep its shape when taught a careful geometry, and the UNESCO entry's geography bounded by Urses Dar and Hassan Dar sets the corridor in which this language of stone traveled. What looks like a tourist circuit today recapitulates a survival circuit yesterday, where families learned when to shift from one node to another and where to wait while danger passed, confident that a neighbor city held the same logic and would accept the same rhythms of breath, water, and order. The strongest proof of a network is that each part makes sense in terms of the others, and Cappadocia dependent rooms clustered around ventilation shafts echo Derinkuyu's insistence on distributed lungs, so that air, light, and movement are recognizable everywhere even when the map is new. UNESCO's framing of troglodyte villages and subterranean towns makes the most important point, that the region's identity is plural and cooperative, with human settlement and rock-hewn sanctuaries combining into a cultural landscape where resilience was taught, practiced, and shared. Long before heritage maps colored the borders, the invisible lines were habits rolling a door from within, routing a corridor to break a charge, isolating a well from above, teaching a child the feel of a landing, habits that could be understood and trusted in any of the linked towns. Proximity matters in an emergency, and modern notes that place these two flagship sites roughly 10 kilometers apart help quantify how quickly a community could merge or separate, a distance that a network of paths and fields could negotiate without spectacle. The count of more than 100 underground settlements makes it clear that redundancy was the regional genius, because many small safe places are harder to extinguish than one large citadel, and learning travels faster when it is repeated than when it is hoarded. In this ecology of refuge, aesthetic and liturgical practices are not separate from engineering and logistics, they are allies, and the UNESCO criteria that celebrate Cappadocia's rupestral sanctuaries also protect the practical infrastructures that let those sanctuaries remain inhabited and meaningful. When the 20th century Rum retreated below at news of violence, they were not inventing behavior but rehearsing a script older than memory, one preserved at Cappadocia in a line that reads like an echo of footsteps in a familiar stair. The enduring idea is that connection is both literal and conceptual, with certain tunnels tying nodes together while a larger and equally important mesh is built of shared designs and shared discipline, allowing the network to function even when stone corridors are closed. That is why the modern management text calls for integrated planning across the region, recognizing that visitor pressure on one node affects the others and that understanding must be paced to preserve the same balance of quiet, access, and safety that let these towns survive in the first place. To walk from Derinkuyu to Cappadocia in the imagination is to feel the network breathing, the same millstone doors ready to roll, the same lamp niches ready to oblige, the same shaft logic ready to carry flame and voice, a common language spoken through different dialects of space. And beyond those two, the list of named sites and unnamed cavities keeps growing, a reminder that what has been surveyed is a summary rather than a conclusion, and that Cappadocia's underground remains a living archive of how people choose continuity when conditions reward caution. So the network is not a rumor but a regional habit honored by stone, geography, and memory, and its proof lies in both a documented 8-9 kilometers link and a UNESCO description that places these towns together inside one cultural organism built to endure. If a single city can teach patience, a network can teach solidarity, and Cappadocia's subterranean web shows how communities multiply time by multiplying places where time can be kept, each node a promise kept on behalf of the others. In the end, the map is a chorus of addresses that agree on what matters: air that is fair, water that is sovereign, movement that is wise, and that agreement is the real connection, the thread that runs beneath fields and roads and down through stairwells to a refuge that never needed an introduction. Only a fraction of the complex is accessible today, a practical boundary that preserves air, stone, and dignity, and every closed corridor is both a clue and a caution, reminding researchers that survival here depended on closures that must not be casually reversed for curiosity's sake. dating the earliest phases remains delicate, with credible scenarios ranging from an Iron Age Phrygian origin refined across Roman and Byzantine centuries, to deeper Anatolian precedents hinted at in regional traditions, and resolving that span will require methods that read stone and soot as carefully as any inscription. The purpose arc is similarly layered: storage and climate moderation first, refuge when history grew loud, yet microscopic evidence for sequence and intensity of use still awaits systematic sampling of deposits, lamp residues, and tool marks across levels that have been stabilized but not overhandled. Chronology is not the only unknown. Extent remains a living question, because even within mapped sections the suggestion of further rooms and lateral veins persists, and the region's habit of linking settlements by design if not always by tunnels argues for caution before declaring any map complete. The wider landscape keeps complicating the picture in productive ways, as the 2014 Nevşehir Fortress project paused for archaeology and revealed a sprawling underground settlement with reports of galleries, a monastery, and multi-kilometer corridors, proving that Cappadocia still holds surprises beneath the most ordinary foundations. Officials describe the Nevşehir discovery in superlatives: hundreds of thousands of square meters, kilometers of galleries, religious spaces from Byzantine and Seljuk horizons, strengthening the case that what is known of Cappadocia's subterranean network is the beginning of a catalogue rather than its end. Early geophysical estimates for the Nevşehir complex even suggested depths and areas rivaling or surpassing the famous nodes, a reminder that regional narratives must adapt as tools reveal dimensions once hidden by surface life and convenience. These finds widen Derinkuyu's context more than they threaten its singularity, because every new node supports the same grammar: distributed ventilation, internalized water, valves for movement, mixed-use rooms, and every affirmation of the pattern makes the open questions easier to frame and test. To address mysteries without harming answers, Cappadocia has benefited from integrated geotechnical and geoenvironmental research, including long-term monitoring of rock performance, stability analyses specific to Derinkuyu, and surveys of climatic conditions in underground structures that inform conservation limits for air, moisture, and load. Such work treats the tuff as a living partner whose behavior can be modeled and managed, mapping joint patterns, stress distributions, and instability risks so that interventions strengthen original geometries rather than forcing them to carry modern habits they were never cut to bear. Microclimate is an archive in its own right, and long-run measurements of humidity, temperature gradients, and CO2 in select underground sites teach managers how many breaths and lamps a room can accept before balance wobbles, turning patience into a policy that protects both visitors and the stone. UNESCO's inscription of Gorim National Park and the rock sites of Cappadocia places subterranean towns within a protected cultural landscape, binding them to monastic sanctuaries and rock-hewn villages in one management frame that prizes traditional habitat alongside artistry, and this integrated view sets the tone for research boundaries. The inscription's emphasis on troglodyte villages and subterranean towns developed since the 4th century, deployed as refuges during Arab-Byzantine conflict, provides an interpretive spine for future studies while reminding teams that cultural value here lies in the interaction of geology, devotion, and domestic life. Sustainable access policies echo that ethic on the ground, pacing crowds, rotating paths, and resting sensitive rooms so that the very atmospheric stability that made long occupation possible is not eroded by admiration, an approach that keeps the lungs working for scholarship as well as for storytelling. Research directions point toward non-invasive mapping before any blade meets stone, exploiting geophysical methods, joint analyses, and multi-year microclimate logs to select where and whether to open new sections, with every choice justified against stability models rather than against appetite for novelty. The Metu joint analysis between Derinkuyu and Cappadocia underscores how structure and geology must be read together, and similar frameworks can guide cautious tests of rumored links or sealed landings, ensuring that any verification adds to safety rather than subtracts from it. At Nevşehir, excavation paused an urban plan and replaced it with an archaeological one, a civic decision that will continue to pay dividends for regional chronology and typology, and the staged opening plan there hints at a model where research and tourism fund each other without forcing pace. Claims of largest and longest in new discoveries must be examined kindly but skeptically, and that examination is best done with geophysics, engineering geology, and careful historical synthesis rather than with spectacle, because grounded comparisons deepen the whole region's credibility. On the interpretive side, lingering questions about who began Derinkuyu can be refined by targeted sampling strategies that respect stabilizations, combining micro-residue analysis in kitchens, iconographic chronology in chapels, and wear pattern studies in thresholds to triangulate usage phases without blunt intrusions. Comparative study with Cappadocia's horizontally expansive plan will continue to frame what is unique to Derinkuyu's vertical emphasis and what is regional standard, a dialogue that lets unknowns shrink naturally as similarities and differences accumulate in shared metrics. The network hypothesis, literal tunnels in places, shared design choices everywhere, remains testable through matched surveys across nodes, and UNESCO's integrated protection map justifies such studies by acknowledging that stress in one site propagates through visitation patterns and expectations to its neighbors. Climate adaptation research has begun to look at underground urbanism as a contemporary tool, and while that field ranges far beyond Cappadocia, it borrows insight from Derinkuyu's proven advantages: thermal stability, distributed ventilation, and lead closure, which modern planners must study without forcing an ancient city to carry modern loads. Methodologically, the sequence is clear: measure before touching, model before opening, and monitor after access, with geotechnical baseline set for each corridor and room so that every future surprise in the data is caught while still reversible. Conservation, like the city itself, depends on redundancy, and systems that watch humidity, CO2, and footfall can backstop each other so that a single sensor failure does not become a slow injury. This mirrors the original builder's refusal to rely on a single shaft for the city's breadth. Sustainable tourism guides add social redundancy to the mix, spreading pressure across seasons and hours, linking nodes so that no single site bears the brunt of curiosity, and training guides as stewards who can explain why sealed doors are successes rather than frustrations. For the next decade, Nevşehir's excavations will likely serve as a laboratory for best practices integrating municipal, ministerial, and academic teams and their reports of monasteries, system-related documents, and multi-era layers should refine how Derinkuyu's own phases are modeled and narrated. The strongest constraint remains ethical. A city that survived by closing must not be asked to betray its logic for research, and sealed zones should be treated as co-authors of the story, present by their absence, guarding secrets until methods become gentle enough to listen without harm. Equally, an honest narrative should resist myths that disconnect the site from human craftsmanship, and the temptation to assign miraculous origins must give way to the documented arc of Phrygian foundations, Byzantine refinements, and regional continuity that already astonishes without embroidery. Unresolved questions about long-distance tunnels such as the oft-repeated 8-9 km link between Derinkuyu and Cappadocia are best answered by a mix of archival synthesis, geological mapping, and selective, non-destructive subsurface prospectation rather than by aggressive probing that risks destabilizing corridors. The UNESCO dossier's language on traditional habitat underlines how research must keep human use at the center, asking how rooms distributed work, rest, ritual, and care, and treating each design choice as evidence for a society that tuned daily life to stone with unusual patience. That patience, borrowed by modern teams, will help settle smaller puzzles too, like the precise function of ambiguous chambers, the sequencing of refectory expansions, or the logistics of oil and wine pressing at depth, all answerable by correlating residues, airflow maps, and wear patterns across comparable rooms. Conservation science can also lean on long-term studies of similar rock-cut spaces in the region to establish thresholds for safe lamp use, group size, and corridor dwell times, translating Derinkuyu's original arithmetic of survival into contemporary management formulas. Even interpretive scripts should evolve under this ethic, presenting sealed thresholds as living experiments in restraint and reminding audiences that what is not shown is often what keeps what is shown alive, a truth this city embodied long before its rediscovery. As mapping improves, the risk of overconfidence rises, and it is crucial to remember that every new survey is a hypothesis, not a command. The stone gets the final word, and the models must bend to its behavior, not the other way around. The expanding catalogue of Cappadocia's underground sites adds enough comparative cases to test typologies: vertical first like Derinkuyu, horizontal first like Cappadocia, mixed-use satellites like smaller nodes, allowing mysteries at one address to be approached with insights gained without touching its walls. The most important unknowns are sometimes the most ordinary: how noise budgets were allocated during full occupancy, how lamp oil was rationed without starving instruction or prayer, how refuse routes were staged without fouling air, all questions that further dignify the daily craft already glimpsed. Every new detail should fold back into the central lesson, that Derinkuyu's endurance rests on a temperament: distributed lungs, sovereign water, reversible closures, and rooms that never force a neighbor to fail, and research must keep that temperament intact even when chasing answers. Across the region, integrated protection remains the best research horizon, because Gorim's sanctuaries and the subterranean towns interpret each other, and a timeline refined in one informs restraint in the others, reducing the urge to make one site carry the weight of all discovery. Nevşehir's partial openings and staged studies show how to pace revelation, letting corridors rest between seasons and keeping documentation ahead of access, a mirror of the old practice of earning safety by closing wisely and reopening only when breath and supply were certain. If climate pressures push modern cities to look underground, planners will find in Derinkuyu a playbook for human factors: sound, air, light, dignity, and should credit the source by refusing to drag ancient rooms into contemporary experiments better run in new stone. So the remaining mysteries are not obstacles but agreements waiting to be signed, agreements that new corridors, if opened, will be opened slowly, that new dates, if pursued, will be pursued gently, and that new stories, if told, will accept the discipline that made old stories possible. In this final turn, the city's silence feels less like a void than like a contract, and the presence of sealed doors reads as a promise to the future that patience will be rewarded with clarity, just as it was in 1963 when a hammer found a hallway by accident and method gave it back its breath. What remains unknown is a measure of what remains strong, and if Derinkuyu has taught anything, it is that knowledge worth keeping is knowledge gained at the speed of respect, with every answer returned to the same ledger that balances use against endurance. The research agenda, then, is simple and demanding: model more than you open, monitor more than you boast, compare more than you disturb, and let the systems that served families for centuries keep serving by not asking them to prove themselves twice. Cappadocia's newest excavations will refine the old questions without erasing them, and that is how it should be in a region where resilience is a shared language and every node adds grammar rather than noise, strengthening an argument that began in stone and continues in care. One day, perhaps, a sealed stair will accept another footfall, and when it does, let it be because the models predicted safety, the rock agreed, and the air promised to be generous, not because impatience knocked too loudly on a door built to protect. Until then, the city's most generous gift is its example, which tells scholars and stewards that the best way to honor a working design is to keep it working, and the best way to approach a mystery is to breathe with it, at its pace, and listen until it decides to speak.